August 15, 1936. A sweltering summer night in Pueblo, Colorado. In a small frame house on West 2nd Street, 15-year-old Dorothy Drain sleeps peacefully beside her younger sister Barbara. The windows are cracked open, desperate for any breeze that might cut through the oppressive heat. Outside, the cicadas drone their endless summer song, masking the sound of footsteps approaching through the darkness. What happens next will shatter two families, expose the darkest failures of American justice, and lead to one of the most heartbreaking executions in our nation's history. Because the man they would execute for this crime, a gentle soul who played with toy trains and called everyone his friend, had the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child. His name was Joe Arridy, and for 72 years after his death, he would smile down from heaven while the world slowly awakened to the truth that America had executed an innocent man whose only crime was being different in a world that demanded conformity. This is the story of how prejudice, corruption, and a hunger for quick justice conspired to murder a child in an adult's body, and how decades later, the truth would finally set him free. The screams that shattered the humid night of August 15, 1936, would echo through the corridors of justice for the next 75 years. Dorothy Drain, just 15 years old, awakened to find a stranger standing over her bed, clutching an axe that glinted in the pale moonlight streaming through her bedroom window. Her sister Barbara, only 12, lay motionless beside her, blood pooling beneath her small head where the intruder had already struck with devastating force. Dorothy's scream pierced the night as the axe fell again, the blade biting deep into her skull with a sickening crack that would haunt investigators for decades to come. But Dorothy Drain was a fighter. Even as darkness closed around her, even as her lifeblood seeped into the cotton sheets her mother had lovingly placed on the bed just that morning, she held on with the fierce determination of a girl who wasn't ready to surrender to the violence that had invaded her sanctuary. When her father burst into the room moments later, drawn by screams that no parent should ever hear, he found a scene that would be burned into his memory until his dying day. Barbara was gone, her young life stolen by a coward who struck children in their sleep. Dorothy clung to life by a thread so thin it seemed it might snap with her next breath. But Dorothy Drain was stronger than anyone imagined. For 6 agonizing days, she fought death with every ounce of strength in her broken body. When she finally succumbed to her injuries on August 21st, she took with her any chance of identifying her attacker through conventional means. The only witness was now silent forever. What Dorothy left behind was a mystery that would consume the small city of Pueblo, Colorado, and ultimately lead to one of the most shameful chapters in American legal history. Because in their desperate hunger for justice, in their need to restore order to a community shattered by inexplicable violence, the authorities would abandon every principle of fairness, every protection designed to shield the innocent, and every shred of human decency. The hunt for Dorothy and Barbara Drain's killer was about to begin, and it would claim one more victim before it was over. Sheriff George Carroll was a man under siege. The brutal axe murders of 2 innocent girls had sent shockwaves through Pueblo's tight-knit community, and the pressure for arrests was mounting with each passing day. Newspapers demanded answers. Parents locked their doors and clutched their children closer. The mayor's office was fielding calls from terrified citizens who wanted to know when it would be safe to sleep peacefully again. So when word came that Denver police had arrested a suspicious man boarding a freight train, Sheriff Carroll saw his salvation walking through the jailhouse door in shackles. Joe Arridy was 23 years old, but you wouldn't know it from looking at him. His dark hair was tousled like a child's, and his eyes held that particular innocence that comes from seeing the world through a lens of perpetual wonder. He was small for his age, barely 5 feet tall, with the soft features and gentle demeanor of someone who had never harbored a malicious thought in his life. Born to Syrian immigrant parents who struggled to understand their son's developmental disabilities, Joe had spent most of his childhood in state institutions designed more for warehousing the feeble-minded than providing care. The Colorado State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives, as it was cruelly named, had been Joe's world for years, a place where society's most vulnerable were hidden away from a world that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. But Joe Arridy possessed something that no institution could diminish: an unshakable capacity for joy. He loved toy trains with the pure enthusiasm of a child on Christmas morning. He made friends easily, seeing goodness in everyone he met. And he smiled, a radiant, infectious smile that lit up even the darkest corners of the facilities where he lived. It was this same innocent smile that greeted Sheriff Carroll when he began his interrogation. And in that smile, Carol saw not innocence, but an opportunity. "Joe," the sheriff began, his voice deceptively gentle, "I need to ask you about some trouble in Pueblo. About what happened to those two little girls." Joe nodded eagerly, as he always did when adults spoke to him. He liked to be helpful. He liked to please people. It was his nature. "I don't know about any girls," Joe said, his voice carrying the slight lisp that had made him the target of cruel jokes throughout his life. But Sheriff Carroll was persistent. Hour after hour, day after day, he wore down Joe's simple defenses with a combination of leading questions, false promises, and the kind of psychological manipulation that would be recognized as torture in later decades. "Joe, we know you were there. We have witnesses. If you just tell us what happened, everything will be okay." "But I wasn't there, mister. I don't hurt people." "Joe, your friend Frank told us you were with him. You don't want to call Frank a liar, do you?" And slowly, inexorably, like water wearing away stone, Sheriff Carroll began to plant the seeds of a confession that would cost Joe Arridy his life. The interrogation techniques used on Joe would later be recognized as psychological torture specifically designed to break the will of vulnerable individuals. No lawyer was present. No family member advocated for him. No one explained his rights or protected his interests. He was alone in that room with men who saw him not as a human being deserving of protection, but as a convenient solution to an unsolvable case. After 72 hours of relentless questioning, interrupted only by brief periods of fitful sleep on a jail cell cot, Joe Arridy began to tell Sheriff Carroll what he wanted to hear. Not because it was true, but because his simple mind had been twisted into believing that cooperation would make the scary men leave him alone. "Maybe I was there," Joe whispered, exhaustion and confusion evident in every word. "Maybe I did something bad." It was all Sheriff Carroll needed to hear. The confession that Sheriff Carroll extracted from Joe Arridy was a masterpiece of manipulation and a monument to injustice. But in the summer of 1936, it was exactly what the people of Pueblo wanted to hear. The case was solved, the killer was caught, and justice would be swift. The local newspapers trumpeted the arrest with headlines that screamed of solved mysteries and captured killers. "Feeble-minded man confesses 2xe murders," read the Pueblo chieftain, the language revealing the casual cruelty with which society viewed people like Joe. But even a cursory examination of Joe's confession revealed glaring inconsistencies that should have given investigators pause. He claimed the murders happened on a Friday when they actually occurred on a Saturday. He described the house layout incorrectly. He couldn't identify the murder weapon when shown photographs. Most damning of all, he placed himself at the scene with Frank Aguilar, a man he had never met and who had his own reasons for wanting Joe to take the blame. Frank Aguilar was everything Joe Arridy was not: cunning, manipulative, and desperate to avoid responsibility for his crimes. When arrested as an accomplice, Aguilar immediately saw an opportunity in Joe's mental disability. Here was someone who could be convinced to share the blame, someone whose testimony would be dismissed as unreliable if he tried to recant. The two men were tried separately, a decision that would prove crucial to the prosecution's strategy. In Frank Aguilar's trial, evidence emerged that painted a clear picture of a lone perpetrator, a drifter who had committed similar crimes before, who had been seen in the neighborhood on the night of the murders, and who possessed both the means and the motive to kill. Aguilar was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he would eventually confess to acting alone. But by then, Joe Arridy's fate had already been sealed. Joe's trial was a mockery of justice that would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. His court-appointed attorney, a young lawyer named Stephen Kochevar, was overwhelmed and underprepared for a capital case. He failed to challenge the confession, failed to present evidence of Joe's mental disability, and failed to expose the coercive interrogation techniques that had produced the false confession. The prosecution painted Joe as a cunning killer who used his disability as a mask for his violent nature. They argued that his supposed mental deficiency made him more dangerous, not less culpable. It was a strategy designed to exploit the prejudices and fears of a jury that had never been educated about developmental disabilities. Joe sat through his trial with the same innocent smile that had characterized his entire life, playing with a toy car that his sister had brought him and occasionally asking when he could go home. He seemed genuinely confused by the proceedings, unable to understand why people were saying such terrible things about him. When the jury returned their verdict after less than 3 hours of deliberation, Joe was still playing with his toy. "Guilty of murder in the first degree," the foreman announced, and Joe looked up with those same innocent eyes, not understanding that he had just been sentenced to die. The judge's words rang out like a death knell. "Joe Arridy, you shall be put to death by lethal gas in the manner provided by law." Joe nodded politely, as he always did when adults spoke to him, and asked if he could keep his toy car. The Colorado State Penitentiary in Cannon City was a fortress of stone and steel designed to hold the worst criminals in the state. Its death row housed murderers, rapists, and violent predators who had forfeited their right to live among civilized society. And then there was Joe Arridy, who spent his days on death row playing with toy trains and making friends with the guards. The contrast was so stark it bordered on the absurd. While other condemned men plotted escapes, wrote angry letters, or descended into the madness that often accompanies a death sentence, Joe maintained the same cheerful disposition that had characterized his entire life. He was genuinely happy to see the guards each morning, greeting them with a smile and asking about their families. "Good morning, Mr. Guard," he would call out, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a child greeting a beloved teacher. "Did you bring the trains today?" The guards, hardened men who had seen the worst humanity had to offer, found themselves genuinely caring for this gentle soul who had somehow ended up in their charge. They brought him toy trains from home, spent their breaks playing with him, and struggled with the growing realization that Joe Arridy was nothing like the cold-blooded killer described in the newspapers. Warden Roy Best was troubled by what he observed. In 40 years of corrections work, he had never encountered a condemned man like Joe Arridy. Best ordered psychological evaluations that confirmed what anyone who spent 5 minutes with Joe could see. He had the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child and was incapable of understanding the nature of his alleged crimes. Dr. George Kearney, the prison psychologist, wrote in his report, "Joe Arridy is without a doubt one of the most harmless individuals I have ever encountered. His mental age is approximately 6 years, and he possesses the emotional development of a young child. The idea that such an individual could plan and execute a brutal double murder is not merely improbable, it is impossible." But the machinery of justice, once set in motion, proved impossible to stop. Appeals were filed and denied. Clemency petitions were submitted and rejected. The Colorado Supreme Court upheld the conviction, writing in their decision that Joe's mental disability did not excuse his crimes but rather made them more heinous. It was a legal precedent that would haunt American jurisprudence for decades to come. The idea that mental disability made a defendant more dangerous, not less responsible. As Joe's execution date approached, a curious thing happened. Letters began pouring in from across the country, from teachers who worked with disabled children, from parents who recognized their own children in Joe's story, from ordinary citizens who couldn't understand how America could execute someone so clearly innocent. Even some of the jurors who had convicted him began to express doubts. One wrote to the governor, "If I had understood then what I understand now about his condition, I could never have voted for conviction. We have made a terrible mistake." But Governor Teller Johnson remained unmoved. In his view, Joe Arridy had been tried by a jury of his peers, convicted by due process of law, and sentenced according to the statutes of Colorado. The fact that he might be innocent, or too mentally disabled to understand his situation, was irrelevant. The execution was set for January 6, 1939. January 6, 1939, dawned cold and clear in Cannon City, Colorado. Inside the state penitentiary, Joe Arridy woke up with the same smile that had greeted every morning for the past 2 years on death row. "Is today the day I get to take a ride?" he asked the guard who brought his breakfast, referring to the execution in the simple terms his childlike mind could comprehend. The guard, a tough man named Robert Patterson who had worked death row for 15 years, found himself fighting back tears. "Yes, Joe," he whispered. "Today's the day." Joe clapped his hands together with genuine excitement. Throughout his time on death row, the concept of death had remained beyond his understanding. To Joe, the ride they kept talking about sounded like an adventure, something new and different to break up the routine of prison life. Warden Best made one final attempt to save Joe's life, calling Governor Johnson personally to plead for clemency. "Governor, I've been in corrections for 40 years, and I'm telling you we're about to execute an innocent man. Joe Arridy no more committed those murders than a 6-year-old child could." Johnson's response was cold and final. "The law is the law, Warden. The execution will proceed as scheduled." As the hour approached, something unprecedented happened in the history of Colorado's death row. The other condemned men, hardened criminals who had shown no mercy to their own victims, began to weep openly for Joe Arridy. They understood what was about to happen in a way that Joe himself never could. "They're killing a baby," one murderer whispered to another. "They're actually going to kill a baby." The execution chamber at Colorado State Penitentiary was a small, sterile room dominated by the gas chamber, a steel cylinder with thick glass windows that looked like something from a science fiction nightmare. Joe entered the chamber still smiling, still excited about his ride. The executioner, a man who had conducted dozens of executions without emotion, later said that watching Joe Arridy die was the worst moment of his professional life. He was so happy, the executioner would tell reporters years later. He thought it was some kind of game. I've never gotten over it. Joe was strapped into the chair with leather restraints, a process he endured with patient cooperation, occasionally asking the guards if they were having fun too. When the warden asked if he had any last words, Joe looked up with those same innocent eyes and said, "No, but I'd like to see some trains." Someone had brought a small toy train, and Joe played with it right up until the moment the cyanide gas began to fill the chamber. His last recorded words were spoken to the toy, "Choo-choo, here we go." The gas took effect quickly. Joe's expression never changed from that same gentle smile that had characterized his entire life. He slipped away playing with his train, never understanding that he was dying, never comprehending the injustice that had brought him to this moment. At 8:42 a.m. on January 6, 1939, Joe Arridy was pronounced dead. America had just executed a man with the mental capacity of a 6-year-old child for a crime he did not commit. For 72 years, Joe Arridy lay in an unmarked grave in Cannon City, his name synonymous with one of the most shameful episodes in American legal history. But death could not silence the truth, and gradually, inexorably, the facts began to emerge from the shadows where they had been hidden by prejudice and expedience. Frank Aguilar, the real killer, eventually confessed to acting alone in the Drain murders. Speaking to a prison chaplain in 1971, Aguilar admitted that he had never met Joe Arridy before their trials and that he had encouraged Joe's false confession to deflect attention from his own guilt. "That poor boy never hurt nobody," Aguilar said in his deathbed confession. "I let him take the blame because I knew they'd never execute someone like me for killing 2 little girls. I was wrong about that, but I was right about Joe. He was innocent, and I watched them kill him for something I did alone." The confession should have triggered immediate action to posthumously exonerate Joe Arridy, but Aguilar's words were dismissed as the desperate lies of a dying criminal. It would take decades more for the truth to gain momentum. In the 1990s, a new generation of legal scholars and journalists began examining the Arridy case with fresh eyes and modern understanding of developmental disabilities, coercive interrogation techniques, and wrongful convictions. What they found was a pattern of misconduct so extensive it read like a textbook on how not to conduct a criminal investigation. The interrogation techniques used on Joe were recognized as psychological torture specifically designed to produce false confessions from vulnerable individuals. The failure to provide adequate legal representation violated his constitutional rights. The prosecution's suppression of evidence pointing to Joe's innocence constituted prosecutorial misconduct of the highest order. Most damning was the discovery of physical evidence that had been ignored or suppressed during the original investigation. Fingerprints found at the crime scene did not match Joe Arridy. Hair samples recovered from the victims' bodies were inconsistent with Joe's hair. Blood evidence suggested a single perpetrator acting alone. Dr. Robert Hare, a world-renowned expert on criminal psychology, reviewed the case files and concluded, Joe Arridy was incapable of committing the crimes for which he was executed. His developmental disabilities made it impossible for him to plan or execute such a violent act. This case represents one of the most clear-cut examples of wrongful execution in American history. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Joe himself, in the form of psychological evaluations that had been sealed for decades. These documents revealed a man whose intellectual and emotional development had been frozen at the level of a first grader, someone who believed in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, who couldn't understand the concept of death, and who possessed neither the capacity for violence nor the cognitive ability to plan a crime. Dr. Ruth Lucassen, a legal scholar and expert on intellectual disability, summed up the case's significance. Joe Arridy's execution represents everything that can go wrong when a society decides that some people are disposable. He was failed by law enforcement, failed by the legal system, failed by the medical community, and ultimately failed by a society that was too prejudiced and too impatient for real justice. On January 7, 2011, 72 years and 1 day after Joe Arridy's execution, Colorado Governor Bill Ritter Jr. signed a posthumous pardon that officially acknowledged what many had known for decades: Joe Arridy was innocent. Standing in the same governor's mansion where his predecessor had refused to grant clemency, Governor Ritter spoke words that had been 7 decades in the coming. Joe Arridy was not guilty of the crimes for which he was executed. This pardon is not just a legal document, it is an acknowledgement of a grave injustice and a promise that Colorado will never again allow prejudice and expedience to trump justice. The pardon was based on overwhelming evidence of Joe's innocence, including Frank Aguilar's confession, newly analyzed physical evidence, and expert testimony about the coercive interrogation techniques used to extract Joe's false confession. But more than legal vindication, the pardon represented a moral reckoning with one of the darkest chapters in Colorado's history. Rebecca Hughes, Joe's great-niece, was present for the signing ceremony. Through her tears, she spoke for a family that had carried the shame of Joe's conviction for 3 generations. Uncle Joe was the gentlest soul you could ever meet. He loved everyone, and everyone who knew him loved him back. Today, finally, the world knows what our family has always known, that Joe could never hurt anyone. The ceremony was also attended by representatives from the Innocence Project, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and disability rights organizations who saw Joe's exoneration as a victory not just for one man, but for all the vulnerable individuals who had been failed by a system designed to protect them. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Governor Ritter read from a letter written by one of Joe's former guards, now in his 90s. "I was there when Joe died, and I want you to know that he was smiling right up to the end. He never stopped believing that people were good, even when they were preparing to kill him. If anyone deserves peace, it's Joe Arridy." The pardon also included provisions for a proper burial marker for Joe's previously unmarked grave. The inscription, suggested by disability rights advocates, read simply, "Joe Arridy, 1915 to 1939. Beloved son, brother, and friend. Innocent." But the most fitting memorial to Joe Arridy came in the form of legislative changes designed to prevent such travesties from happening again. The Joe Arridy Act, passed by the Colorado legislature in 2012, established new protections for defendants with intellectual disabilities, including mandatory competency evaluations, specialized training for attorneys, and strict guidelines for interrogations. Today, visitors to Woodpecker Hill Cemetery in Cannon City can find Joe Arridy's grave marked with a simple headstone that bears his name, his dates, and one additional word, innocent. But Joe's true monument isn't made of stone. It's written in the laws that now protect others like him, in the changed hearts of those who learned his story, and in the reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied when truth finally prevails. The case of Joe Arridy stands as a testament to both the worst and best impulses of American society. It shows us how prejudice, fear, and expedience can conspire to destroy an innocent life. But it also demonstrates the power of truth to transcend death, the courage of those who refuse to let injustice stand, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest chapters of our history. Joe Arridy died as he lived, with a smile on his face and love in his heart for a world that had shown him precious little kindness. But his death was not in vain if it prevents even one more innocent person from suffering the same fate. His story reminds us that in a society that claims to value justice, we must be eternally vigilant against the forces that would sacrifice the innocent for the sake of convenience. In the end, Joe Arridy's greatest victory was not his posthumous pardon, though that was long overdue. His greatest victory was the simple fact that even in the face of unimaginable injustice, even when the entire weight of the state was arrayed against him, he never lost his capacity for joy, his faith in human goodness, or that radiant smile that lit up even the darkest corners of death row. They tried to silence Joe Arridy with cyanide gas on a cold January morning in 1939. But his voice echoes still, whispering to us across the decades. Treat the vulnerable with kindness, seek truth over convenience, and never forget that justice without compassion is not justice at all. Joe Arridy finally got his ride, not to death, but to immortality, where his innocent smile reminds us all of what we can be when we choose mercy over vengeance, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear. His train has finally reached its destination, and Joe Arridy is home at last.